My cheating mother not only betrayed my dad but also painted him as the villain, destroying him financially and emotionally. She pushed him so far that he lost all hope, and she left me behind to chase her new life with her affair partner. 10 years have passed, and she's still struggling with the mess I made of her life in return, and I couldn't be happier knowing she'll never fully recover. Disclaimer: this is a long story. It's not groundbreaking or unique, just me pouring out my thoughts and frustrations about my life. Growing up, I thought my family was pretty normal. We weren't wealthy, but things felt steady. My dad worked hard as a technician at a local company, while my mom stayed home to take care of me until I was about 10. From the outside, we probably looked like the perfect little family. But looking back now, I can see that things were far from perfect. The cracks were there, even if I didn't understand them at the time. My dad, Greg, was the kind of man you could rely on. He was quiet, humble, and always put others first. He didn't have a flashy personality or try to be the center of attention, but he was dependable and kind to the core. He worked long hours to keep us afloat and made sure I never went without. If my bike needed fixing or I needed help with homework, he was there, no questions asked. I idolized him. My mom, Sandra, was different, bold and full of energy. She had a magnetic personality that drew people in. She'd light up a room with her jokes and charm, and everyone seemed to like her. At least, that's what people saw on the outside. Inside our house, though, it was a different story. She had a sharp tongue and a short fuse. Small things would set her off: if Dad forgot to grab something from the store, if I left my shoes in the wrong spot, or if dinner wasn't exactly to her liking. But instead of yelling outright, she'd use her words like knives. Her comments were cutting, and she had a way of making you feel small over the tiniest mistakes. She acted like she was doing us both a favor just by tolerating us. Back then, I didn't recognize it as toxic. I just thought she was particular or had high standards. Dad bore the brunt of it. He never raised his voice or stood his ground when she criticized him. Instead, he'd apologize, fix what she was upset about, and try to move on. I think he believed that staying calm and avoiding conflict was the best way to deal with her. But it wasn't just about keeping the peace, it was like she enjoyed having power over him, controlling him in subtle ways. Things started to shift when I was 14. My mom got a job as a receptionist at a small law firm. For the first time in years, she seemed genuinely happy. She came home with stories about her coworkers, her projects, and how exciting it all was. At first, I was happy for her. So was Dad. He told her how proud he was of her for getting back into the workforce. Then the late nights started. At first, it seemed innocent, just a few extra hours here and there to finish paperwork or attend a work event. Dad didn't think much of it. He trusted her completely and encouraged her to focus on her career. But soon, the late nights became a regular thing. She'd miss dinner or come home after midnight, sometimes not even bothering to explain where she'd been. I could see it weighing on Dad. He never said anything to me, but I'd catch him sitting at the kitchen table late at night, staring at his coffee with this faraway look. He started staying up just to wait for her, but when she finally walked through the door, their conversations were cold and short. One night, I woke up to muffled voices coming from the kitchen. My parents were arguing. Their voices were low, but the tension was thick enough to choke on. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught enough to know Dad had asked why she was spending so much time at work. She shot back, accusing him of being paranoid and insecure. That argument ended with a door slamming and Mom storming off to their bedroom. The next morning, Dad pretended like nothing had happened. He made me breakfast, asked about my plans for the day, and even kissed Mom on the cheek before heading to work. But I could see the sadness in his eyes, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. Over the following weeks, things spiraled. Mom started dressing differently, buying new clothes, wearing makeup every day, and even getting her hair done regularly. She said it was for work, but something about it felt off. Then came the phone. She got a new one and treated it like it was the crown jewels. She wouldn't let it out of her sight, even taking it into the bathroom with her. At first, I tried to ignore it. I was a teenager, after all, and I didn't want to get involved in my parents' problems.
But then something happened one evening that I just couldn't ignore.
One afternoon, my dad, Mike, came home from work earlier than usual. He looked pale, almost ghost-like, and clutched a piece of paper in his hand. I asked him what was wrong, but he just shook his head and told me not to worry. Then he went straight to his room, closing the door behind him. At the time, I didn't think much of it, but that slip of paper turned out to be the beginning of the end for our family. It was a hotel receipt, one my mom, Karen, had conveniently forgotten to mention. Dad had found it while sorting through some bills. That night, he confronted her about it.
And she didn't even try to deny it.
When he asked her about the hotel stay, she admitted she was seeing someone else. But instead of apologizing or showing any shred of remorse, she turned the blame on him. "It's your fault," she spat.
"You've pushed me away. You're not ambitious. I feel like I'm suffocating in this marriage."
I didn't hear their argument firsthand. Dad told me about it later, his voice hollow and broken, like he'd been drained of everything that made him the man I knew. From that night on, everything fell apart.
It was like Karen had stopped pretending to care.
She started staying out even later, sometimes not coming home until morning. When she was home, she barely acknowledged either of us. She treated Dad with open contempt, as though he was nothing more than an annoying hurdle in her way. I tried to tell myself that maybe they'd work it out, that things would settle down somehow.
But deep down, I knew better.
The damage was done, and there was no going back. Dad did his best to hold it together for me, but he was unraveling. His warm, steady demeanor disappeared, replaced by someone I barely recognized. He stopped sleeping, his face became thin and tired, and his shoulders slumped like he was carrying the weight of the world. One afternoon, I came home from school to find him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an envelope. When he saw me, he quickly tucked it away and forced a smile, but his eyes betrayed him.
Something was deeply wrong. I asked what was bothering him.
After a long silence, he said quietly, "I don't know how much more of this I can take."
That sentence haunted me for weeks.
Then came the night Karen decided to introduce me, indirectly, of course, to her affair partner.
She didn't bring him to the house or anything like that.
Instead, she waltzed into the kitchen while I was doing my homework and casually announced, "I'm seeing someone."
She didn't offer his name, any details, nothing. Her tone was so indifferent, like she was talking about trying a new recipe or signing up for a gym.
I sat there, stunned, unable to find the words. When I finally managed to ask about Dad, her response made my blood boil. "This has nothing to do with him," she said dismissively, like Dad was just some insignificant footnote in her life. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her it had everything to do with him and with me, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there in silence, biting my cheek until I tasted blood, while she poured herself a glass of wine and strolled out of the room without a care.
After that, things escalated fast.
Karen wasn't content with just cheating on Dad, she seemed hell-bent on destroying him. She started spreading lies, telling anyone who would listen that he was controlling, emotionally abusive, and that he'd driven her into someone else's arms. None of it was true, of course, but she was so convincing that even some of our relatives started to believe her.
But that wasn't the worst part.
One afternoon, while I was at school, Dad was arrested. I came home to an empty house, the front door left ajar, and an overwhelming sense of dread settled over me like a heavy fog. A neighbor came by a few minutes later and said they'd seen the police take him away in handcuffs.
I didn't understand what was happening until later that evening, when I overheard Karen on the phone. She was laughing.
Casually chatting with someone about how she'd filed a police report accusing Dad of domestic violence.
My stomach twisted into knots. I knew my dad, he wouldn't hurt a soul. He wasn't capable of that.
But I also knew how manipulative Karen could be when it suited her. The weeks that followed were nothing short of a nightmare. My dad, Mike, spent several nights in jail before he was finally released on bail. By then, though, the damage was already done. His arrest had made the local news, and it didn't take long for word to spread. He lost his job and, with it, the respect of many friends who suddenly kept their distance. He was crushed. The court battle dragged on for months. My mom, Karen, played her part to perfection, showing up at hearings with tear-streaked cheeks and a trembling voice. Meanwhile, my dad looked like a shadow of himself, sitting silently as her lies painted him as some kind of monster. The legal system wasn't on his side. With no hard evidence to clear his name and Karen's emotional testimony swaying the court, the judge ruled against him. That decision cost him everything. His reputation was ruined, his savings were wiped out by legal fees, and he couldn't even afford to stay in our home. He had to move into a tiny apartment on the other side of town, barely furnished with second-hand items. I wanted to live with him, but Karen had full custody. I was stuck with her. Living with Karen after that was unbearable. She treated me like I was just another piece of property she owned, someone to manipulate and control. If I ever mentioned Dad or tried to defend him, she'd shut me down immediately. "You don't know what he put me through," she'd snap, twisting the narrative once again. I started to despise her. Meanwhile, Dad was hanging on by a thread. He tried to put on a brave face, sending me texts every few days to check in, always trying to sound upbeat. But I could see through it. Every time I visited him, he looked worse. His apartment was bare, just a mattress on the floor and a couple of thrift store chairs. Then, one day, my world shattered. It was a Saturday. The morning started like any other, with Karen glued to her phone, barely acknowledging me as I left to spend the afternoon at a friend's house. I hadn't spoken to Dad in a few days, not unusual at that point. He'd been withdrawing more and more, and I figured he just needed space. When I came home that evening, the house was unusually quiet. Karen wasn't there, and for a moment, I thought I might have the place to myself, a rare and welcome reprieve. But then I noticed an envelope on the kitchen counter with my name scrawled on the front in Dad's handwriting. My stomach churned as I picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a letter, carefully folded and written in his familiar script. It began with an apology. He told me how much he loved me, how proud he was of the person I was becoming, and how sorry he was that he couldn't keep going. He explained that he had nothing left, no job, no money, no hope. He wrote about how Karen had systematically destroyed him, the false accusations that sent him to jail, the lies that ruined his reputation, and the way she drained their accounts while he was locked up, leaving him with nothing. But what broke me was his description of how she'd looked him in the eye and told him he deserved it all. He begged me not to carry hatred in my heart. Not for her sake, he made that clear, but for mine. He didn't want me to let anger consume me the way her actions had consumed him. By the time I finished reading, I was sobbing so hard I couldn't catch my breath. I called his phone over and over, desperate for him to answer, but it went straight to voicemail every time. That's when the fear truly set in. An hour later, my worst nightmare came true. A police officer knocked on the door to deliver the news. My dad had been found in his apartment. He'd taken his own life. The world around me blurred. The officer kept talking, but his words sounded distant, like they were coming from underwater. My chest tightened, and I felt like I was falling, even though I was standing still. Karen's reaction was a punch to the gut. She looked shocked at first, but not in a grieving way. More like someone who'd just heard about an unexpected change in plans. "I didn't think he'd actually do it," she muttered before walking off to make a phone call, as if nothing more than mild inconvenience had just occurred. I wanted to scream at her, to rip her phone from her hands and force her to face what she'd done. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I locked myself in my room, clutching Dad's letter like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. The funeral was small and somber. Most of his old friends didn't show, too afraid, I guess, of the stigma attached to his name. Karen was there, of course, playing the grieving widow for all to see. But her crocodile tears only fueled the anger simmering inside me. And as I stood there, staring at his casket, I made a silent promise to myself, I wouldn't let his truth die with him. Most of the people who attended my dad's funeral were there out of obligation, not out of genuine care. His name had been dragged through the mud so thoroughly that even his closest friends hesitated to show up. Karen, my mom, played her role as the grieving widow flawlessly. She cried on cue, accepted condolences with grace, and acted as though she wasn't the one who had driven him to this point. I didn't cry at the funeral. I couldn't. I just stood there, staring at the casket, feeling numb. All I could think about was how everything had unraveled so completely and so quickly. In the weeks that followed, my numbness gave way to anger. While I grieved in silence, Karen went on with her life as if nothing had happened. She continued going to work, spending time with her affair partner, and occasionally tossing out meaningless platitudes about moving forward. Each word she spoke felt like a slap to the face. But instead of screaming at her, I channeled my anger into something else. I took my dad's letter, the one he left me before he died, and scanned it into my computer. Then I wrote a long email, attaching the letter as proof, and sent it to everyone who mattered. Family members, family friends, even a few of Karen's co-workers. I didn't care about the fallout. I just wanted the truth to be known. The responses started coming in within hours. Karen's phone began buzzing non-stop, and I could hear her raised voice from the next room as she tried, unsuccessfully, to do damage control. But the letter was too raw, too real. It left no room for doubt. Her family turned against her almost immediately. Friends who had supported her during the divorce stopped returning her calls. And then came the final blow: she lost her job. Apparently, someone from her workplace had forwarded the email to her boss. They decided they didn't want someone with that kind of baggage representing their company. Karen had no idea I was the one who leaked the letter, and I didn't plan to tell her. Part of me felt guilty, she was still my mother, after all. But a larger part of me felt vindicated. For months, she had painted herself as the victim while tearing my dad apart piece by piece. She showed no remorse, no grief for the man she had once loved. Now, she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. I avoided her as much as I could after that. But living under the same roof made that difficult. Since I was still a minor and the court had granted her full custody, I had no choice but to stay. It felt like a cruel joke, being trapped with the person who had caused so much pain. She, on the other hand, seemed to resent me just as much. Though she never said it outright, the tension between us was unbearable. Every interaction was clipped and cold. If I forgot to do a chore or came home late, she'd lash out with cutting remarks, blaming me for adding to her stress. I learned to keep my head down and wait. On my 18th birthday, I finally told her I was moving out as soon as I graduated. I expected her to argue, or at least guilt-trip me into staying. But her response stunned me. "Do whatever you want," she said with a shrug. That was it. Her indifference was the final straw. From that moment on, I stopped trying to salvage any kind of relationship with her. By the time graduation rolled around, I'd saved up enough from part-time jobs to move into a small apartment with a friend. Packing my things felt like shedding a weight I'd been carrying for years. When I walked out of that house for the last time, I didn't look back. I haven't looked back since. It's been over a decade now, and I haven't spoken to Karen once. She didn't reach out when I moved out, when I started college, or when I got my first job. But I'd be lying if I said I don't think about her sometimes, not out of love or longing, but out of curiosity. Does she regret what she did? Does she think about my dad and the life she destroyed? I doubt it. She never seemed capable of self-reflection. But if she ever reads this, I want her to know one thing: I hope she feels the weight of her choices every single day. I hope the man she chose over her family leaves her, too, so she can understand what it feels like to lose everything. Leaving Karen's house felt like being released from a prison I hadn't even realized I was in. For the first time in years, I could breathe. There were no icy glares, no passive-aggressive remarks, no constant reminders of the toxic web she had spun around my dad and me. It was just me, my friend, and a tiny, run-down apartment that smelled faintly of mildew. And yet, it felt like freedom. I threw myself into building a new life. College became my sanctuary, a place where I could finally focus on something other than my grief and anger. I buried myself in my studies, worked multiple part-time jobs to pay the bills, and avoided anything or anyone that reminded me of Karen. For a long time, I kept my past hidden. It was too raw, too painful to explain, and I didn't want to be defined by it. But some nights, the memories would creep in, uninvited. I'd sit alone in my room, staring at the one photo of my dad I'd managed to save before I left. It was from my 10th birthday. He was standing next to me, his arm draped over my shoulders, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. I used to wonder if he'd ever regretted marrying her, if he'd ever felt trapped the way I had. His letter stayed locked in a small box under my bed, alongside a few other mementos, his watch, a tie he used to wear to work, and a napkin with a silly doodle he'd drawn during one of our family dinners. Sometimes I'd take the letter out and read it, even though I knew every word by heart. It reminded me of the man he truly was, the man Karen had tried so hard to erase. For years, I carried an unbearable guilt over his death. I replayed our last conversations over and over, wondering if I could have done something, anything, to save him. Maybe if I'd been louder, braver, he would have held on. But as I got older, I began to understand that the blame didn't lie with me. It was her. Karen made the choices that destroyed him. She filed the false accusations, emptied their accounts, and left him to face the wreckage alone. She turned his love and trust into weapons against him. This realization didn't erase the pain, but it brought me clarity. It gave me a reason to keep moving forward. As the years passed, I started reconnecting with people who had truly known my dad. His sister, my aunt, became like a second mother to me. She had always suspected Karen wasn't as innocent as she claimed, but after I shared the letter, she cut all ties with her. I should have done more, she told me, tears in her eyes. I should have fought harder for him. We spent countless hours talking about my dad, his quirks, his habits, and the little things that made him who he was. She shared stories of their childhood, how he used to sneak her extra desserts, help her with her homework even when he didn't understand it, and stand up to anyone who tried to mess with her. Those stories brought me closer to him in ways I hadn't expected. I also reconnected with some of his old friends. Many of them had distanced themselves during the legal battle, either because they believed Karen's lies or didn't know how to handle the situation. But after the truth came out, they reached out to me with apologies and regrets. One of them, a man named Steve, told me about a conversation he'd had with my dad shortly before everything fell apart. "He loved you more than anything," Steve said. "He always talked about how proud he was of you, how he wanted to make sure you had a good life, no matter what happened." Those words stuck with me. As for Karen, I haven't spoken to her since the day I moved out. She didn't call or text when I graduated college, didn't congratulate me when I landed my first full-time job, and didn't reach out when I got engaged. At first, it hurt. Despite everything, there was a part of me that wanted her to care, to show some shred of regret for what she'd done. But over time, I stopped expecting anything from her. I heard bits and pieces about her through the grapevine. She stayed with her affair partner for a few years, but he eventually left her. From what I gathered, he got tired of her baggage and moved on. After that, she bounced between jobs, never staying anywhere for long. Sometimes I wonder if she ever thinks about me or about my dad. Does she feel remorse? Does she lie awake at night, haunted by the life she destroyed? I'll probably never know. And that's okay. I've built a life I'm proud of, a career I love, friends who feel like family, and a partner who loves me in a way that feels safe and steady. My dad's memory lives on in the little things, the way I laugh at bad jokes, the way I double-check my work, or the way I approach life with quiet determination. But there are moments when the past sneaks up on me. I'll hear a certain song or catch a familiar scent, and for a split second, I'm back in that kitchen, holding his letter and feeling the weight of everything he couldn't say in person. It's been over a decade since I left Karen's house, and in that time, I've done a lot of soul-searching. At first, all I felt was anger, seething, all-consuming anger that kept me awake at night. I used to fantasize about confronting her, about throwing every ounce of pain she caused me and my dad back in her face. I wanted her to feel the damage she'd done. But as the years went on, I realized something: she wasn't capable of remorse. People like her don't wake up one day and suddenly see the error of their ways. They don't change. The justice she faced wasn't the kind you see in movies or hear about in courtrooms. It wasn't dramatic or immediate. It was slow, like watching a house rot from the inside out. And in the end, that's enough for me. I've moved on. I've healed. And I've built a life that honors the love my dad gave me, a life that's mine, free from her shadow. Losing her family, her friends, her job, it was all a direct result of her choices. No one forced her to cheat, to lie, to manipulate, or to destroy a good man's life. Those were her decisions, and the consequences were inevitable. Even knowing that, I've wrestled with the question of whether it was enough. Did she suffer as much as my dad did? Did she ever feel the suffocating despair that led him to take his own life? Part of me hopes she did. But another part of me knows it doesn't matter. No amount of suffering on her part will ever bring him back. One of the hardest things to come to terms with has been the lasting impact of her actions, not just on my dad, but on me. Her betrayal didn't end with his death, it seeped into every corner of my life, shaping the way I see the world and how I navigate relationships. For years, I struggled to trust anyone. I kept people at arm's length, terrified of letting them get too close. If my own mother could turn on my dad so viciously, what was stopping anyone else from doing the same to me? It wasn't until I met my partner that I began to let those walls down. They were patient with me, understanding in a way that no one else had been. They didn't push me to share more than I was ready to, but they also didn't let me retreat into myself. Slowly, I began to open up about my past, about my dad, my mom, and everything in between. It wasn't easy. There were nights when I broke down in tears, overwhelmed by memories I thought I'd buried. But every time, they were there, reminding me that I wasn't alone anymore. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what justice really means. For the longest time, I equated it with revenge, making my mom pay for what she did. And in some ways, I got that. Her life fell apart, and she's been living in the wreckage ever since. But justice isn't the same as closure. Justice is external. It's about accountability, about making sure the truth is known and the person responsible faces the consequences of their actions. Closure, on the other hand, is internal. It's about making peace with what happened and finding a way to move forward. I got justice for my dad when I leaked his letter. It exposed the lies my mom had been spinning for years and gave him back the dignity she tried to take from him. But closure? That's been harder to come by. There are still days when the grief hits me like a wave, when I hear his favorite song on the radio or pass by a hardware store and remember how he used to fix everything in our house himself. Those moments remind me of what was stolen from me, and the anger flares up all over again. But there are also days when I think about how far I've come. I think about the life I've built, the people I've surrounded myself with, and the love I've found in places I never expected. And in those moments, I realize that closure isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about not letting it define me. To my mom, if you're reading this, I want you to know that I've moved on, not because I forgive you, but because you're not worth the space you used to take up in my mind. You ruined a good man's life. You destroyed a family. And for what? A fleeting affair with someone who didn't even stick around. Was it worth it? Did it make you happy? I hope you've spent the past decade grappling with those questions. I hope the silence in your life is deafening. And I hope that in the quiet moments, when you're alone with your thoughts, you feel the weight of what you've done. You once told my dad that he deserved everything that happened to him. But the truth is, it was you who deserved it. And now, you're living it. As for me, life goes on. My dad's memory is a part of me, woven into the fabric of who I am. He taught me about resilience, about kindness, and about the importance of standing up for what's right even when it's hard. I can't change the past, and I can't bring him back. But I can honor him by living a life he would have been proud of. And that's exactly what I intend to do.